I'm Autumn Lockett.
And this is Mitch Randall.
And you're listening to Good Faith Weekly.
Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. And on this episode, Autumn are going to catch up. We're going to talk about nurses on bicycles, as well as the Civil War that is unfolding in the Republican Party. And we may even dive into the GameStop fiasco that occurred last week on Wall Street. So stay tuned. Lots of great things coming up. Plus, an interview with Sarah Posner, who has an extraordinary book called Unholy. So stay tuned. You won't want to miss it. Autumn, how are things over in the Lockett household?
Well, I don't know if you know this about me, Mitch, but I played the flute for like 8 years. And I feel like I can toot my
braggart.
In fact, I can look at it sitting up on the top of my office right now. Like I still have it. But, you know, we seem to be sort of gearing up for Civil War. And I'm not much for battle. I'm not a super tough gal. But I can maybe stand at the front and like pipe some kind of a little ditty on the right side of history. So that's how things are going here.
So we're going to have a picture of you with your flute and one of your sons, you know, the little drummer boy, and
Yes.
your husband waving the flag. So that's going to be great.
He's just going to like wave his hair back and forth. Sort of a little mascot.
Wow, the new Norman Rockwell picture. Oh, yes. There seems to be a civil war of sorts brewing. Not only is the rhetoric between the right and left continue to escalate, but within the Republican Party, there seems to be a civil war afoot, and that is what direction the Republican Party is going to take after President Trump left office. It seems as though his influence still remains. And there was a big debate this week, especially on the House side, between what direction they were going to go, whether they were going to somehow discipline Liz Cheney for voting against or voting for impeachment, or go the way of Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is a conspiracy theorist promoter, deeply committed to President Trump, as well as a QAnon supporter. So it's interesting to see. There's some really great people over on the right side of the aisle. Liz Cheney said that she voted her conscience, and for someone to say that Liz Cheney was a traitor to conservative ideals is absolutely insane. She's got a staunch record of being a conservative on many, many issues. And then on the Senate side, you're hearing from Mitt Romney and even Mitch McConnell, two stalwart conservatives, talking about how dangerous the road that the Republican Party is heading down right now. So, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Are they going to go the way of sensible, compassionate conservatism, or are they going to go the way of crazy town?
Yeah, they keep referring to the Republican Party as a really big tent. And I think sometimes the tent starts to have red and white stripes on the top of it and some clowns pouring out of it. It's not the conservative party I grew up in.
Right. There's this wonderful idea. It's called the Poplar paradox. And the paradox is that for people who are attempting to create a large tent in an organization, who are really trying to be an inclusive organization and bring a diversity of people underneath this tent. The problem is, if you want to be inclusive, there's really only one person or set of people that you must exclude, and that's the exclusionist. Because if exclusionists are ever inside that tent, if they are ever allowed to gain a foothold, then your organization, your group, will never be able to achieve inclusiveness. And so it's called the paradox. To be inclusive, you must exclude exclusionism. And I think that's right. And I think that's where the Republican Party finds itself right now. Which direction they are going to go. And I do hope with all my heart that they choose the sensible way, because I do believe in a two-party system. I believe that there needs to be a conservative party, a liberal party, and checks and balances, and so that we can all hold each other accountable. That is what democracy is. And I just hope and pray that the Republican Party comes to its senses and can follow a pathway forward. Yeah. Well, speaking of finding a pathway forward, the rollout of the vaccine. I don't know about you, but it seems like it's a mess. We're starting to talk to people who have gotten their first dose, waiting on their second dose. And it seems like no matter where you live in this country, it's all different. People are getting different information, not understanding how to sign up. Can they get the vaccine in one location and then get it in another location? It just seems like an absolute mess. And you were saying off the pod a moment ago that all we need to answer this horrible, horrible pandemic and get everybody vaccinated is nurses on bicycles. Please tell me what you're talking about.
Yes. Well, especially if the nurses are nuns, I feel like they could just get it done. I have come quite late to the Called the Midwife Party. It's a show from the BBC. And I happen to have been pregnant for about the past 14 years and finally I'm not. And so I can watch the show without my mama hormones kicking in. And in the current season that I'm on, they are fighting polio and tuberculosis, and the nurses just roll up into these neighborhoods, and they have a plan, and they get these adults and children through the vaccination clinic. They do their x-rays that they need to do for tuberculosis, and then everything's fine, and you just see them in their habits on their bicycles and sometimes a scooter for the peppy ones, and they just get it done. But I think the timeline that was set in, you're in London post World War II, not very far post, because
Right.
they're still diffusing live bombs and things, and so there is still this sense of community,
Yeah.
and that we're doing this not just for my good but for the community good.
Yeah.
And so I wish I could bottle up a little bit of that and kind of shake it over our whole country.
Right, absolutely. Call the Midwife was created by the BBC. Heidi Thomas is its creator, but it was based on the memoirs of Jennifer Worth, who worked with the community of St. John the Divine there in East London. And it is a remarkable book. It's also a remarkable show. I commend it to everyone. But I think you're right. I mean, if we would just put nurses in charge of this rollout, I mean, things get done when nurses are in charge. So let's get everybody else out of the way and just empower the nurses to take care of this, because then everybody would have a jab in the arm.
Absolutely.
Well, speaking of jabs, Wall Street took a little bit of a jab last week with this crazy situation that unfolded. A subgroup within the website Reddit began to buy GameStop stock at a lower price. And when you begin to buy it like that, the stock prices began to escalate. And after a couple of days, GameStop stock was at extremely high rates, even though the box store probably has a shelf life because of online gaming. But it was fascinating. And what really caused a stir was that when this group basically played by the rules, bought stock in this company, raising its price and its value, then all of a sudden the power brokers who had bet against GameStop's success, they bought stock that it would fail, betting against the company. Then all of a sudden they were losing millions of dollars because it looked as though, on paper at least, the store was gaining value and traction. Well, all of this was happening, and then all of a sudden there were certain investment companies that halted trading. And it was just absolutely asinine because it revealed the hypocrisy of Wall Street. That if you are an individual or if you're a common person who wants to invest and manipulate the system by, again, playing by the rules, then if you begin to cause issue with some of the more powerful and wealthier investors and companies on Wall Street, then they'll shut you down. Yeah. And it was kind of scary, to be quite honest with you.
Yeah, it was. And I think a lot of people who have touted how well the stock market has done and different things like that that never actually benefit from anything to do with it, had a lot of opinions about things that they knew nothing about during the past couple
Well,
of
I do not plan to be an expert or understand the nuances of what happened last week. But one thing I am for sure about, it revealed the hypocrisy of the economic system that's in place in the United States and other developing countries. Or developed countries. When you read the Bible, especially the Gospels, Jesus was such an advocate for the poor and the commoner, and he just fought against systems that took advantage of the poor and the commoner. And as a good faith believer, as a Christian, I think we are called to sound out a voice and a challenge to our society that calls out the hypocrisy and the corruption that we see in the systems, especially economic systems, that give such an advantage to rich people and to rich organizations, but limits the upward mobility of the commoner. We need a more level playing field. And we've heard politicians talk about this. We've heard pastors talk about this. We've heard theologians talk about this. There's a deep need to rethink some of the institutions that we have as a country based upon this idea of social justice. It does not mean that we should get rid of them, but they need to be reformed in order that there can be a level playing field for everybody on the field.
Yeah, and that's the kind of system we should all root for as people of good faith.
Absolutely. Well, next, Autumn, we know that you were out this week, and so I interviewed Sarah Posner, who is the author of Unholy, trying to discover why evangelicals worship at the altar of Donald Trump. It's a wonderful book. It is very fascinating, and my conversation with Sarah was extraordinary. So I want to encourage our readers to stay tuned as I talk with Sarah Posner.
Lot Carey is proud to bring you conversations with some of the best and brightest pastors coast to coast. Our new podcast, Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving, delivers wisdom from the Black church for the whole church. Find us wherever you get your podcast or listen online at lotcarey.org. That's LOTTCAREY.org. We look forward to the pilgrimage with you.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us, Sarah Posner. Sarah is a reporting fellow with Type Investigations. Her investigative reporting analysis on the religious right in Republican politics has appeared in a myriad of volumes such as Rolling Stone, The New Republic, Vice, HuffPost, The Nation, Mother Jones, New York Times, and Washington Post. She is a prolific author and a wonderful researcher. Her 2008 book, God, Prophets, Faith, Fraud, and the Republican Crusade for Value Voters, explored the unholy alliance between the Republican Party and prosperity TV evangelist. Her latest book, which we recommend highly, Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump, is in bookstores right now. So, Sarah, welcome to Good Faith Weekly. We are delighted that you are with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Sarah, first of all, we just want to ask all of our guests during this time of pandemic, how are you? How's your family? Are you feeling okay?
We're all feeling okay, thank goodness. My mother got the first dose of her vaccine last week.
Excellent.
So that was very exciting. But yes, we've been holding up fine.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Well, let's just kind of jump right in. But before we jump into the book, let's begin with a little bit of background, because your journalism, your stories, your writing is very particular. Both of your books address the relationship between faith and politics, but more precisely, the alliance between the religious right and the Republican Party. So I've got to ask, why does this topic interest you, and how in the world did you get started covering it?
Well, why it interests me, I think a lot of people who might be listening to this podcast, it probably interests them also, because it tells us a lot about how we got to the place that we are right now in American politics and in American religion, particularly American Christianity. I got into this when I was in college back in the very long time ago, 1980s. And I wrote my senior thesis about the religious right, which was at the time in 1985, 1986, just at the start of being built as a political infrastructure inside Washington, D.C. And although I did not immediately become a journalist after I graduated from college, I ended up going to law school and practicing law for a long time before I made the turn to journalism. This was something that interested me throughout that period anyway. I've always been very interested in politics. And over that period, George W. Bush became president, and the religious right saw its power grow during his presidency. We saw the backlash against Bill Clinton by the religious right, the backlash against Barack Obama's presidency by the religious right. So it's just something that I've always had an intense interest in.
Sure. Now, our listeners are keenly aware of the relationship between the religious right and the Republican Party, but that's been brewing for a long time now. Many of our listeners lived through those dark days of the Southern Baptist takeover by fundamentalists. Now, do you think, because some of us have kind of batted this around a little bit, do you think that the takeover of the SBC was the beginning of this formal relationship fusing right-wing theology with right-wing politics?
I don't know that it was the beginning, but it was another symptom of what was happening at the time, because it was something that happened over the same period that other parts of evangelicalism were getting involved in Republican politics. So you had, say, the independent fundamentalist Baptists who were getting involved from the angle of fighting the IRS on the tax exemption issue for Christian schools, where they didn't want the IRS to tell them that they needed to desegregate or have non-discriminatory admissions policies. So that was one thing that was happening along the way. The Southern Baptist Convention, the takeover by the fundamentalists was happening sort of on the same track. All of this was part and parcel of the evangelical alliance with the Republican Party, which was also happening while there were efforts to bring conservative Catholics into the Republican Party. And so all of these things were happening simultaneously.
Yeah, and it happened simultaneously. You had the takeover of the SBC, and then, of course, the candidacy of Richard Nixon, and certainly his Southern strategy, if you will.
Right.
And then, of course, you had the rise of the moral majority, which you talk about quite extensively,
right.
Yeah, during Ronald Reagan. So, so a lot of this was happening at the same time. What a lot of us are trying to wrestle with the idea of why this came about. Was this a direct reaction to what was going on in the country? Was it a continuation of white supremacy that this country has always been facing? Why do you think it has become so paramount today?
Well, I think you're right. It was changes that were happening in the country along with the legacy of white supremacy. I think about it this way, and this is what I argue in Unholy, is that this was a reaction to, it was a racist-driven, racial grievance-driven reaction to changes that were taking place over the course second half of this 20th century. And it wasn't just about race, right? It was about cultural dominance. It was about secularism. It was about patriarchy. So you had a lot of changes that were happening, from Brown v. Board of Education to the Supreme Court decisions on school prayer and Bible reading. That was a few years later. You had the Civil Rights Act, you had the Voting Rights Act, you had school desegregation, then you have the women's rights movement, the feminist movement, Roe v. Wade. And so, it was a progression of things. I think people like to think about it as Roe v. Wade happened and then the moral majority happened. And it was a lot more complicated than that. Jerry Falwell was very involved in pushing back against all these other changes, all these other civil rights changes. And so when you look at it through the lens that we're seeing it now, you see that this was a movement that was building against democracy, right? It started out as a movement that was against democratic change, small d democratic change, which was a more pluralistic society, a society that protected the civil rights and human rights of every citizen and treated them with dignity. These were obviously aspirational things.
Sure.
This was not something we ever actually fully achieved, but these were the aspirations of, the civil rights movement and these changes that we're talking about.
Right.
And over time, what we've seen with the religious rights relationship with the Republican Party and then with Donald Trump is that this has been a movement that has been steadily walking towards this opposition to not only these democratic values, but democratic institutions, and including, as we've seen more recently, the democratic institution of having free and fair elections.
There are many of us that have been combating fundamentalism, right-wing theology, right-wing politics for quite some time. I've even got the scars to prove it, so to speak. Right. But there, it was kind of you got used to that battle, that fight, that issues that you could debate, the mischaracterization by many on the right, on people on the center or left of things. And you fell into this, I hate to use this word, but this comfortable confrontation between two ideologies. And I knew how to battle the fundamentalist and the religious right at one time. But then 5 years ago, something happened that I think transcended the whole thing and upset the apple cart more than I could ever imagine. And that's the rise of Donald Trump. And that is what Unholy unpacks for us so eloquently. 5 years ago, candidate Donald Trump rose to the top of the Republican Party presidential ticket. At first, some right-wing evangelicals were cold on Trump, citing his crude behaviors. But something happened. As the campaign continued and it became apparent he was going to be the candidate, most of them began to embrace him. Now, why do you think that happened?
It happened because they were following the base. What we saw over the course of his primary campaign was that the base, when it had a choice of Donald Trump, two PKs, Ted Cruz and Scott Walker, other candidates who spoke their language, who were evangelical, who checked off all the litmus test boxes that the religious right always wanted, the base chose Donald Trump. And the religious right leadership really had no other choice but to go along with it. Now, why did the base choose Trump? We can unpack that a little bit more, but I think that one of the changes that we need to talk about that led to this moment was the rise of these subcultures within evangelicalism, in the Pentecostal and charismatic communities that emphasize, the prosperity gospel, direct revelation, people who claim to be prophets with direct revelation from God, this whole kind of culture around this televangelism. I think that in terms of leadership, that was the predominant leadership that backed Trump early on, like his spiritual advisor, Paula White. And then the political leadership of the religious right, the Ralph Reeds and the Tony Perkins, came on later. But it was because the base liked Trump because his xenophobic, racist appealed to them. Right. And the base also liked Trump because part of the base was hearing from these televangelists and these self-described prophets and these figures in the New Apostolic Reformation who believe that, that they're hearing from God and they heard from God that Trump is going to be president and that he's the King Cyrus of our time. And sometimes God chooses an unlikely leader to lead a country, to lead a nation at a very critical point in its history. And so you had those things sort of collide together, reaching the point where the leadership had no choice in a way. I mean, obviously they had a choice, but they probably felt like they had no other choice. Because the base had gone in the direction of Trump. And then everybody kind of got on board with this idea that God had chosen him, because sometimes God chooses somebody unlikely. And look at Donald Trump, who could be a more unlikely leader for the Christian nation, which, the fact that he rose to the top is proof that God, sometimes picks an unlikely leader.
Yeah. And I guess that was probably the most confusing part of the last 5 years for those who are looking on the outside in to the support of evangelicals or right-wing theologians and pastors to the presidency of Donald Trump, was that at one time it seemed to be a party that just always talked about morals and values. It was the moral and value culture. And of course, we all recognize it was their understanding and their perspective of morals and values. But then all of a sudden, it seems as though they just threw all that out the door and were more concerned about gaining power, gaining control, and it became even more prevalent that you had these bigoted ideas, these bigoted policies that were put in place. You mischaracterized, villainized people of color, tried to legitimize white supremacists and fascists. It was just, it just seemed to happen overnight. And that's what you do such a great job in your book, kind of outlining how that took place in this worship of Trump.
Yes. And, I think it's important to also look at it through the lens of history, that the history of the religious right is also the history of what was at the time called the New Right, the movement post-Watergate that sought to revitalize a conservative movement in a more right-wing populist vein, to kind of reject the National Review, country club kind of conservative for a more flyover America, middle-class, white Christian populist movement. And when you look at the history of the New Right, and I do this in Unholy, there, it was driven a great deal by racism and a backlash to the civil rights movement. And there were leading figures in the New Right who later became heroes to what we now call the alt-right. So the sort of white supremacist right. And this was the movement that specifically sought to bring in evangelicals in this coalition, this right-wing coalition that would remake the Republican Party. And you could make the argument that they never really sort of achieved the full potential of this vision until Donald Trump came along, right? Sort of bringing the kind of racist, white supremacist right together with the Christian right. Mm-hmm. I think over the period from Reagan to Bush, what you saw was, an effort, sort of an episodic effort, a whack-a-mole kind of effort to get rid of the more extreme people, right? And what we're seeing now, for example, with Marjorie Taylor Greene, from the Congresswoman from Georgia, who's just really out there with the conspiracy theories and the anti-Semitism and so forth, is the Republican Party doesn't know what to do with her.
Right. Yeah, sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Because they're realizing that, the base that they've enabled through the period of Trump wants this kind of person to be representing them. Yeah. So I think that the moralizing was kind of a cover for their anti-democratic values, small d democratic values. Sure, yeah. And once Trump kind of blew the lid off of that, right? So it's like, okay, now that doesn't matter anymore. We found a leader who would champion the white Christian nation without us even really having to resort to all of that moralizing. We can just frame it as this imperative that we save Christian America from the social justice warriors, mm-hmm. or the Antifa or the socialists or all of the bogeyman that the right is currently trying to paint anybody who's to their left.
Yeah. What was fascinating in the book, and I'm going to read a section here in just a second, that somehow Trump was able to transcend mere politics, to tap into this really spiritual connection with his base. And in the book you write, in Trump, the Christian right sees more than a politician who delivers promises. They see a savior from the excesses of liberalism. Now, that is a powerful statement. I've got two questions regarding that one sentence.
Okay.
First, what do you mean when the Christian right sees Trump as a quote-unquote savior? And second, has the Christian right so closely associated now liberalism with their definition of sin that oftentimes they see that as intertwined, that if you're a liberal, you're a sinner? So let's talk about the savior part first, because that's fascinating.
Right. So and I think that this was definitely accelerated by the Supreme Court's decision in Obergefell in 2015, legalizing same-sex marriage. If you look at all of this from the arc from Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 through Obergefell in 2015, so it's a 50-year arc there, 60-year arc, and over that period, the religious right persistently sees itself as being under threat. It sees itself as being under threat to the Christian schools, to Bob Jones University, after school desegregation. They paint themselves as being, the family is under threat from Roe v. Wade. The family is under threat by, the feminist movement. The family is the church, and the family structure is under threat by getting rid of prayer in public schools. And then, our religious freedom is under threat by this, that, and the other thing. The Christian nation needs to be restored. And the final nail is Obergefell, from their point of view. And they liken it to the Bob Jones University case and say, this means the government's going to come after us if we take our tax exemptions away. Christians are going to be persecuted. I mean, all of this is overblown hyperbole, obviously, but this is the hyperbole that they get the base mobilized around. And so Trump comes along, and even though he himself is a libertine, and he himself has never indicated that he, until he entered politics, that he opposes abortion or same-sex marriage or equality for LGBTQ people, he signals to them that he wants to restore this America that's been lost. He signals to them that he's willing to do anything. Like, he doesn't care about the democratic process. He doesn't care about bipartisanship. He doesn't care about any kind of collaboration. He's willing to just walk roughshod over everything. And he's even willing to use violence. I think that, now we see the culmination of that. But in real time, it was evident that he relished violence, and he was willing to egg his supporters on to engage in it. Mm-hmm. So they saw in him somebody who was really willing to go to the mat, in their view, for him. And that America, in their view, was on the brink of being lost. And he was a strong enough man to come and save it.
Well, you mentioned the Capitol insurrection. And the one thing that was startling to me as a Christian was to see pictures that said Jesus saves, and the picture was of Trump. And it seemed as though they were saying that, he is somehow God's deliverer now, and has supplanted Jesus as that deliverer.
Yes, some of the signs said, Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president. Mm-hmm. But even just making a sign like that, sort of conflating the idea that your president, who your president is, can be uttered in the same breath as who your savior is, mm-hmm. Is very indicative of how they have elevated, many of them have elevated him to this sort of, this Messiah status.
Sure. And the second part of my question had to do with this kind of equating liberalism to sinners. One of the things that I've been trying to articulate for years and years has been, when I look at my brothers and sisters who are more conservative than I, who reside in the Republican Party, I never question their faith. I question some of their theology and some of their politics, but I don't dissuade their genuine faith in the person of Jesus or the God that they worship. But on the opposite side, when people call me a liberal, so it's like that's the worst thing you can call somebody if you're on the right is a liberal. That I've heard numerous times, as well as a lot of my colleagues have heard, you can't be a Christian and a liberal, or you can't be a Christian and a Democrat. Is that the norm in your research from the religious right, or do you still hold out hope that they may disagree with some of the more progressive ideas that we have, both in theology and politics, but they don't see us as the devil incarnate, so to speak?
Well, I mean, I think that the rhetoric that I have observed over the past 5 years is really around the bend on this. I mean, this has been this kind of demonization of liberalism and of their fellow Christians who are liberals. This goes back a long ways. I mean, if, I don't know how old some of your listeners might be, if they remember somebody like Carl McIntyre or Billy James Hargis. These kinds of demagogues have been with us for a while. But I think now there is more of an organized political movement that has in the religious right, that has a very us and them kind of character to it, whereby if you're with us, you're with us, but if you're against us, you're a traitor. I mean, I've seen the language really go that far. I'm thinking about after the 10 Republicans in Congress voted with the Democrats on the one article of impeachment for the second impeachment of Trump. And Franklin Graham on his Facebook page compared them to Judas.
I saw that.
And asked what were the 30 pieces of silver that Nancy Pelosi offered them. I mean, so, so this idea of who's in the right and who's in the wrong transcends religion, it transcends politics, it transcends partisanship, right? So like, it doesn't matter if those Republicans were Christian or evangelical or anything, or Republican. The fact that they voted against Donald Trump made them a Judas. And that's kind of where a lot of the rhetoric is right now. And those 10 Republicans aren't even liberal.
Right, I know.
They were conservatives who wanted to hold Donald Trump accountable.
It's fascinating since President Trump has left office now, of what is happening in the Republican Party, what's happening in this conservative family. That there's a lot of infighting going on right now, and who's going to control the future of that movement. Well, I've got one question before we get to our final question, and the question centers on just kind of your experience in writing the book. Again, Unholy is a very well-researched book. You did an excellent job outlining this argument. It's fact-based. I highly recommend it to all of our listeners today to go to Amazon or wherever you pick up your books to read or listen to, buy it today. But it's so well researched. I'm certain that you learned a lot in the process, but you did even more than that. You had encounters with some of these individuals and with these churches. During your research and compiling of the book, what surprised you?
I think that even though in real time you could see this gathering, in real time, I'm talking over the course of the 2016 campaign, you could see this gathering veneration, adoration, worship of Donald Trump. What surprised me, I think, was how it didn't slacken over the course of his presidency, over his scandalous presidency. It intensified.
Right.
And, I finished the book around the time that the first impeachment was getting underway. And his followers, his loyalists, saw the impeachment as not a chance for them to evaluate whether he had done anything wrong. It was just taken as a witch hunt hoax that was perpetrated by his enemies, the Democratic Party. And it was then that I realized that there wasn't anything that was going to erode their worship of him, really. As I was writing the book, I kept wondering whether there was going to be something that was going to finally make them say,
right, sure,
this is it. And that never came. It hasn't even come after the insurrection.
Mm-hmm.
After the insurrection, their reaction is either he did not incite it, it didn't happen. It was, Antifa or Black Lives Matter protesters who were posing as MAGA supporters. So there's just this sort of disinformation bubble that they're living in. And I'm not really sure how you break that. It goes beyond a dispute over policy or ideas or theology. We're talking about they're living on a different reality plane.
Right. We all scoffed when he uttered those famous words, now I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and not be convicted of it. His base wouldn't lose any support from his base. I think he's right.
Yes.
I think he's 100% right. Because after, 4 years of all of this, and certainly culminated on January the 6th, if there was anything you think that would turn his supporters against him, it would be an attempt to overthrow the Capitol and thwart democracy. But no, it just emboldened them, even to this day.
The truly shocking thing, too, I thought, in the midst of the whole thing was shocking, obviously, that they continued to support him after that, but was that there were men stalking Mike Pence inside the Capitol, chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." I
know.
A lot of the leading figures of the religious right have been friends with Mike Pence far longer than they've known Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And has there been a more loyal foot soldier for the religious right than Mike Pence?
Right. Exactly. So, well, we have lived through this bizarro world. I think we continue to live through it. As we have said, Trump may not be in the White House anymore, but Trumpism is here to stay for a while.
Yes,
and we continue to have to combat it and to fight it and make certain that it is not successful in this democracy. Well, we ask one final question to all of our guests, and you have been a delight. Thank you so much for spending so much time with us. But our motto or our tagline at Good Faith Media is, "There is more to tell." So, Sarah, what is your more to tell?
My more to tell, I think, is finding out more about the role of religion in the insurrection. I think we've just started to scratch the surface of what happened there and how people were either motivated by their perception of their own faith or were energized by faith leaders or by Christian nationalist leaders to engage in, if not the events of January 6th, events leading up to January 6th. I think this is an important part of the story that has not gotten the attention that it deserves, because obviously we've been focused a great deal on A, criminals being apprehended, and I think B, the role of militias and survivalists and so on, and, armed white supremacist groups. But this is a really important part of the story of January 6th.
So what I just heard is coming in 2022, Unholy Steps to the Capitol by Sarah Posner, right? Third book. Well, Sarah is the author of Unholy: Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. It is in bookstores now. Make certain to buy your copy today. Sarah, it's been a delight. Thank you for joining us at Good Faith Weekly.
Thank you so much for having me.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this episode. Until next time, keep living good faith.